Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive.
I did.
We're tackling the Spanish language,
Its history
its quirks,
and its global impact.
and we like to start with a good hook,
Right.
right?
Get this. Spanish is the second most spoken native language in the world.
Wow.
That's right.
Trailing only Mandarin Chinese in sheer number of speakers.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
To understand how it got there.
We need to take a journey back to its roots.
Okay, so back to the beginning,
Our source material
which comes from excerpts of the Wikipedia article on the Spanish language
tells us Spanish originated from what's called Vulgar Latin.
on the Iberian Peninsula.
Okay.
Can you tell us a little more about what that is?
Sure.
So Vulgar Latin might sound a bit harsh.
But it's simply the colloquial form of Latin that everyday people used in the Roman Empire.
As opposed to the formal Latin used in literature or official documents. It's the ancestor of many modern-day languages.
Including Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, what we call the Romance languages.
So as Latin spread throughout the Roman Empire,
And people on the Iberian Peninsula started speaking it.
their version gradually evolved into what we now know as Spanish.
Exact.
But it wasn't just about Latin changing in isolation.
Imagine a linguistic melting pot,
Where Spanish
even in its early stages.
started incorporating words and grammatical structures from the languages spoken by neighboring communities.
That makes sense.
Languages are constantly interacting with each other.
Right.
So which languages left their mark on Spanish?
Well, a major influence came from Arabic.
Thanks to the Moors, who ruled parts of the Iberian Peninsula for centuries.
In fact, did you know that about 8% of modern Spanish words have Arabic roots?
Wow.
8%, that's a significant chunk of the vocabulary.
It is.
And it highlights how deeply intertwined Spanish history is with the Moors.
It wasn't just about conquest. It was about cultural exchange.
That's fascinating.
And are there any other languages that had a significant impact on Spanish?
Absolutely.
One that stands out is Basque.
Which is spoken in a region that straddles the border between modern-day Spain and France.
Okay.
Now, what makes Basque really intriguing,
Is that it's what linguists call a language isolate.
this means it's not related to any other known language family.
It's like this lone wolf on the linguistic family tree.
A language isolate.
That's amazing.
So even though Basque is relatively small in terms of the number of speakers,
It still managed to influence Spanish.
yeah.
It goes to show you that even languages with ancient roots have a story to tell.
So how did Spanish go from this blend of influences to becoming more standardized?
That's where a pivotal moment in Spanish linguistic history comes in.
The publication of the first grammar book for any modern European language.
Wait for it, 0.4492.
1492.
Okay, that year rings a bell.
Wasn't that the same year Columbus set sail?
That's right.
And it's not a coincidence?
Use the year Spain was truly emerging as a global power.
And with that came a need for standardized communication.
So this grammar book, and how did it impact the Spanish language?
The author was Antonio de Nebrija.
And his grammar book essentially codified what was then known as Castilian.
Establishing it as the language of empire,
This standardization was essential for Spain's expansion.
because it provided a common way to communicate across vast distances and diverse populations.
That's really interesting.
So would it be accurate to say that Nebrija's grammar book was like the key that unlocked Spanish's potential to become a global language?
Absolutely.
It's amazing how one book could have such a profound impact on the trajectory of a language.
It really makes you think about the relationship between language and power.
But you used an interesting term earlier.
Castilian.
That's something I've always been a bit fuzzy on.
How is Castilian different from Spanish?
Are they the same thing?
That's a question that often sparks debate.
Even today.
Within Spain itself?
There's a lot of sensitivity around regional identities.
Oh, I can imagine.
Spain has such a diverse cultural landscape.
Yeah.
So Castilian refers specifically to the dialect that originated in the Castile region of Spain,
It's the dialect that formed the basis for standardized Spanish.
the official language of Spain,
But it's essential to remember that Spain has other languages spoken within its borders.
like Catalan, Galician, and Basque.
Right.
So while Spanish is often used as an umbrella term to encompass all of these linguistic variations,
The term Castilian acknowledges the specific historical and cultural context of the dominant dialect.
so it's about recognizing the nuances and respecting regional identities within Spain.
Precisely.
Even the Spanish Constitution
While using Castilian to define the official language.
recognizes the existence of other Spanish languages.
That's a really thoughtful approach.
But no matter what you call it,
Spanish has undeniably made made its mark on the world.
It's not just confined to Spain anymore.
It's a global language spoken across continents.
That's right.
But I'm curious.
Are there any places where Spanish popped up that might surprise people?
You bet.
While we often associate Spanish with Latin America,
Which makes sense given its history.
the language spread further than you might think.
Through colonization and cultural exchange.
You can find pockets of Spanish speakers in some unexpected corners of the globe.
Take the Philippines, for instance.
The Philippines.
I wouldn't have guessed.
It might seem surprising.
But remember,
Spain colonized the Philippines for centuries.
this left a lasting legacy.
From Spanish loanwords in local languages to a Spanish-based Creole language called Chavacano.
Which is still spoken today.
Wow, Chavacano.
I'm adding that to my list of linguistic curiosities to explore.
But the Philippines isn't the only unexpected place where Spanish took root.
Is it?
Not at all.
Another example is Equatorial Guinea.
A country on the west coast of Central Africa.
Spanish is an official language there.
A remnant of its history as a Spanish colony.
That's really fascinating.
It's incredible how the echoes of history resonate through language.
Even across continents.
The now. It really highlights how Spanish traveled the world, taking root in all sorts of unexpected places.
But even within those regions,
Spanish isn't some monolithic entity,
it's a language that loves to express itself in a variety of ways.
each with its own unique flavor.
We're talking about dialects, of course.
Right. I was just thinking about that.
Even someone with a basic understanding of Spanish like myself.
Can hear the differences in how people from different Spanish-speaking regions speak.
Yeah.
There are distinct accents, different slang words.
It's all Spanish, but with its own local spin.
Exactly.
And one of the most noticeable variations is in pronunciation.
Particularly how certain consonants are produced.
Wow.
Take, for instance, the C before an I or an E.
And the letter Z.
Okay.
In some parts of Spain,
They pronounce these with a P sound.
like in thin,
Yeah.
I've definitely noticed
Like
that.
if you were to say Barcelona with that pronunciation.
Sounds very distinct.
Exactly.
And then hop over to Latin America,
And you'll find they pronounce the C before I or E.
and the letter Z with an S sound instead.
And sin.
Right.
So Barcelona becomes more like Barcelona,
It's fascinating how these subtle shifts in pronunciation can make such a difference.
isn't it?
And it's not just about individual sounds either.
There's a linguistic phenomenon called ceseo.
That affects how the S itself is pronounced in different dialects.
Okay.
In some regions, it's a sharp S sound,
While in others, it's softer.
almost like a lisp S.
It's amazing how these tiny variations can create such distinct flavors within the broader Spanish language.
It is.
And those variations aren't just random.
They often reflect the history of how Spanish interacted with other languages and cultures in those regions.
So each dialect carries a bit of its own unique story within its pronunciation.
Absolutely.
And speaking of stories,
There's one particular variety of Spanish that's like a linguistic time capsule.
preserving a fascinating slice of history,
We're talking about Ladino.
also known as Judeo-Spanish.
Oh, yes, Ladino.
I was so intrigued when I came across that in the research.
It sounds like something straight out of a history book.
What exactly is Ladino?
It essentially represents the language spoken by descendants of Sephardic Jews.
Who were expelled from Spain in the 15th century.
They carried their language with them as they fled.
And it evolved in fascinating ways.
So even after being forced out of Spain,
It was held on to their language.
they did.
But it's important to note that Ladino isn't identical to modern Spanish.
Think of it more like a cousin who took a different path.
That's a great way to put it.
So how did Ladino's journey diverge from the Spanish spoken in Spain?
Well, as Sephardic Jews settled in new communities,
Places like the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and even parts of Europe.
Ladino absorbed linguistic elements from its surroundings.
It took on words and phrases from Turkish,
The Greek.
creating this beautiful tapestry of influences.
It's like Ladino became this incredible blend of cultures woven into a language.
That's so cool.
But is Ladino still spoken today?
Sadly, Ladino is considered critically endangered,
Many native speakers are older.
and for a variety of reasons.
It's assimilation.
Historical
but
events.
The language wasn't always passed down to younger generations.
It's always a shame when a language with such a rich history faces the risk of disappearing.
But are there any efforts being made to revive Ladino and keep it alive?
Yes, thankfully.
There's a growing movement to revitalize Ladino.
And music has been a powerful force in this effort.
Music.
That makes sense.
I imagine there's a rich musical tradition associated with Ladino, right?
There is.
Ladino music often blends Spanish flamenco influences with the sounds of the places where Sephardic Jews settled.
creating this really unique and captivating sound.
I can see how music would be so powerful in preserving a language.
It's engaging, it's emotional,
Emotional.
it stays with you.
I'm going to have to look up some Ladino music after this.
It's amazing to me how we can trace history through language.
They're like following these little linguistic breadcrumbs.
It really is.
And speaking of tracing things back,
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the building blocks of Spanish.
the words themselves.
Okay.
We've touched on how other languages have influenced Spanish.
But I think it's worth taking a closer look at these linguistic borrowings.
Endgame.
I always find it fascinating how languages borrow words from each other.
It's like they're constantly sharing and evolving.
But where do we even start?
Spanish has such a vast vocabulary.
You're not wrong.
But I think a good starting point is recognizing the foundation.
We know that roughly 75% of Spanish vocabulary can be traced back to Latin.
It is a Romance language, after all.
That makes sense.
But it's not just about those Latin roots, right?
What about all the other influences that have shaped Spanish over the centuries?
Exactly.
We've talked about the Arabic influence,
Those words that made their way into Spanish during the Moorish period?
right? Like almohada for pillow,
Exactly.
and many of those words like almohada.
Are so ingrained in the language that people don't even realize they have Arabic origin.
It's a testament to how completely those words have been absorbed into Spanish.
It is.
But the linguistic exchange doesn't stop there.
Let's not forget the contributions of indigenous languages from the Americas.
That's right. When we think about the Spanish spoken in the Americas, it's impossible to ignore the impact of indigenous languages.
Absolutely. When Spain colonized the Americas,
It wasn't a one-way street in terms of linguistic influence.
there was this fascinating exchange happening.
So you're saying Spanish didn't just impose itself on indigenous languages, it also adopted words and phrases from them.
Precisely.
Some of the words we use every day
Like chocolate and tomato.
actually came from Nahuatl,
Okay.
an indigenous language spoken in central Mexico.
They entered Spanish and
From there, spread to countless other languages.
wow. It's amazing to think about how food in particular has acted as a vehicle for this kind of linguistic exchange.
I mean, could you imagine a world without chocolate or tomatoes?
I certainly wouldn't want to try.
But the influence goes beyond just food.
There are words related to plants, animals, customs,
All sorts of things that found their way into Spanish.
enriching the language and reflecting the cultural blending that was happening,
It really highlights how dynamic languages are.
constantly evolving and adapting.
Right.
I have a bit of a word nerd question for you, though.
If Spanish have all these borrowings from other languages,
How can we be sure which words are originally Spanish?
is there some sort of linguistic litmus test?
That's a great question.
And it's not always a simple answer.
Linguists often have to play detective.
Looking for clues within the word itself,
Its structure, its sounds.
how it relates to similar words in other Romance languages,
So it's like tracing the genealogy of a word.
following its family tree back through time
Exactly.
by looking at these linguistic connections.
We can often get a good idea of where a word came from and how it's evolved over time.
That's fascinating. It makes you realize that language is a living,
Breathing fish.
shaped by centuries of interactions and influences.
It truly is.
As we wrap up our deep dive into Spanish,
I think that's one of the biggest takeaways.
it's a language deeply rooted in history
Shaped by countless encounters with other cultures,
and constantly evolving,
and its journey, much like the language itself.
is far from over.
You're right. We've traveled from the Iberian Peninsula to the Americas and beyond.
All through the lens of the Spanish language.
But this leaves me with one final thought.
Given its global reach and the dynamic nature of language itself,
Where do you see Spanish headed in the future?
that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Will Spanish continue to diversify?
Giving rise to even more distinct dialects.
Or will globalization and the internet lead to a more standardized form of the language?
It's fascinating to think about.
It's a reminder that language is never static.
Always changing and reflecting the world around us.
Precisely.
And who knows what linguistic surprises await us down the road.
That's the beauty of it all. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the fascinating world of the Spanish language. We hope you enjoyed this linguistic adventure.
Until next time.
Keep those ears perked and your curiosity piqued.